Okay, so we just finished up Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and now James Madison is going to become president. So at the end of the PowerPoint, you should be able to do these things. So you should be able to identify Madison's domestic and foreign policies. You should be able to describe tariffs for internal improvements, to list the causes of the War of 1812, and to understand the heightened sense of patriotism. All right. So after Jefferson had served 2 terms as president, he followed the precedent set by Washington, and he stepped down from the presidency. And James Madison, who was also a Democratic Republican, becomes the nation's 4th president. Now, his domestic issues, and domestic is dealing with things going on within the United States. He puts Henry Clay in charge of the economy, and Henry Clay proposes an American system to Congress where he proposes a high tariff, which would be a tax on imports to protect American manufactured goods from competition with cheaper British products. And the money made from those tariffs would be used for internal improvements, such as new roads and canals. Now, this never went into full effect because he never got the funds from Congress. Now, the big thing about James Madison's presidency is the War of 1812. There had been a lot of tension rising for the past couple of presidencies, and a lot of tension with Britain. And so at this point, British Navy men are still practicing impressment, which is forced military service of U.S. sailors. And it had gone on for so long. And this caused a shipping interference, obviously, because they then took those ships or whatever, and so they weren't able to deliver things. And so that's going to be one of the causes of the War of 1812, is because James Madison finally says enough is enough. We have to defend what is going on, and we can't basically just let other countries do whatever they wanted to do. Another reason is British supported Native American resistance. So they encouraged Native American Indians to attack American settlements. So that's going to be a smaller cause, but it's still there. And then war hawks is another term you need to know. These are people who supported going to war. So they thought it was time to go to war because of impressment. And there was also some congressmen that thought it was time to seize or take Canada from the British. So the British had owned that land in Canada, and we thought it was time to expand north to Canada. Now, President Madison asked Congress to declare war on Britain in 1812. Now, the War of 1812 does not just last 1 year, it lasts a few years, but it does obviously start in 1812. Now, there are a few major events of the War of 1812 that you really need to know. This isn't a war that we get super detailed in everything that happened, so it's just a few things that you need to know. So one of them is the attack on D.C. And when I say D.C., I mean Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. So that's where the U.S. capital is. So U.S. forces tried to invade Canada, and they failed to do so. In retaliation, British troops temporarily occupied D.C. and they burned down the White House. So this is the only time in U.S. history that another country has actually burned down the White House. Now, Dolly Madison, who was James Madison's wife, she quickly removed paintings and other valuables from the White House before the British arrived. So they knew the British were coming, and so she was able to save a couple of things. Now, much of the fighting occurred around Great Lakes in upstate New York, and it's also going to occur in New Orleans, and we'll see about that. So like I said, we're not going to go into super big detail about the War of 1812. We're kind of just going over the big events. So here we have ending the War of 1812. So those were a couple major events, but this is going to be ending the war. In 1814, in about December, a peace treaty was signed between Britain and the U.S., and it's called the Treaty of Ghent, and that is a term you need to know. Now, in this treaty, it was promised 2 things. Britain promised to recognize America as a sovereign nation, and Americans promised to respect British rule in Canada. So if you kind of look at that, looking at it now, it's kind of like they just decided to put things like they were before they went to war. So a lot of people argue whether or not the war was worth it. Some people argue, did the U.S. really win if everything's still the same? But all those are opinions. And Americans felt that they had proved that they could protect their independence. Now, here's the thing about the War of 1812 ending. communication was so slow between them signing the Treaty of Ghent because they were in Europe. And so by the time they get news in the United States that they had signed this treaty, we actually had our bloodiest battle, which was fought after the treaty was signed. So that's going to be fought at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. So the treaty was signed in December 1814, and the battle is going to be in January 1815. So it's about a month in between the two. Now, General Andrew Jackson defeats the British at this battle and kind of helps him rise to higher political standing. And they were fighting over New Orleans because it was a port city. But, I mean, it's kind of irrelevant because the treaty had been signed anyways. Now, some effects of the War of 1812. This is a big one. Number one, it established the U.S. as a country with an identity. At this point in time, the United States was more seen as Virginians, New Yorkers, Marylanders. They weren't really seen as Americans like we see each other today. It was very focused on like each state. So now it's going to establish it as a full country. Now, one thing, Francis Scott Key, he writes the Star Spangled Banner while imprisoned in Baltimore on a British ship, and it later becomes our national anthem. And another effect is that the morale, which would be American pride, it increases. It proved that the U.S. was a powerful force, and the war became known as the Second War of Independence. Another thing you need to know for your test is that it increased economic growth. So it increased manufacturing capabilities due to a British blockade. So the British had basically blocked where we were getting goods from overseas to us. Because of that, there was a shortage of cotton, and so northeastern manufacturers met that demand, and they started producing much more cotton. So that's going to help manufacturers and the economy in whole. So that's going to provide economic growth. Now, they're going to increase tariffs on imported goods, so taxes on imported goods. This is to make American products more competitive with imported goods. They also create the Lowell system, and it places all stages of manufacturing under one roof, replacing the earlier domestic system where people worked at home. So that doesn't sound super important, but it is, because at this point in time they were making every different product, and each person would just make their little piece at home, and then they would all come together. But the efficiency is going to go up after they start manufacturing everything under one roof. And also we have improved U.S. Army. Now, his foreign policy, these are a couple other things that happened with Madison. We have the Rush-Bagot Pact. It was an agreement between the U.S. and Great Britain to demilitarize the Great Lakes, keeping only a limited number of small patrol vessels there. So basically get rid of a lot of the military that was near the Great Lakes. Then you have the Convention of 1818. It determined the 49th parallel to be the upper boundary of the United States. So that's what we know as today as the upper boundary. Then we have the Adam-Onis Treaty of 1819, which defined land that would be Spanish territory, and it gave Florida to the U.S. So it's going to be at this point that we get Florida. Now, here's some economic effects of War of 1812. Some of them are repetitive. If it is repetitive, that means it's very important and very likely to be on your test. So we have the expansion of manufacturing due to the blockade. We have the Erie Canal that is built. They wanted to connect Lake Erie to the Hudson Water. And the effects of that are three different effects. One, caused a modification of the physical environment. Two, cities grew along the route. And finally, Western farmers could send goods to New York, which helps New York grow into the largest city in the U.S. So here's a picture of the Erie Canal just so you can kind of see what they were wanting to do. So they were wanting to connect Lake Erie to the Hudson Water, so to New York basically. So you have all these farmers out here who are either manufacturing things or farming things or whatever, and they wanted to transport it and be able to ship it to New York. So that's going to be the easiest route they take, and it takes a while to make, and it's very expensive, but it winds up being huge to contribute to the U.S. as we see it today. Now, the activity at the bottom of the student note guide is the War of 1812 Quick Write. What I want you to do is, using your notes, answer the question or the prompt. It says, most historians agree that no one won the War of 1812. Do you agree? Did the U.S. gain more than it lost? Why or why not? So there's no wrong answer to this prompt. It's just using evidence from your notes. You need to use at least two facts from your notes as evidence to support your answer. All right, so that's going to be it for War of 1812. And that's going to be the last thing that will make its way on your test, which is this Wednesday.